You are sitting reading a novel. You are totally absorbed in it. It feels really real. You are interrupted. The world of fiction still feels realer than the world around you, which seems watery and thin. Then, in a millisecond or a minute or more, there's a shift of gravity when the source of feeling, whether we call it the feeling of the real, the feeling of living, or experience, shifts location from the pages of the book to life. This happens to readers all the time. It's an experience represented in novels themselves all the time. Here is Jane Eyre reading in the opening pages of that book, just before she is rudely interrupted. Ordinary readers, critics, and scholars have been trying for centuries to account for how and why fiction seems able to compete in the reality business with life. Some of the most promising recent developments in this field have derived assistance from cognitive science, and you're welcome to ask me about that in the Q&A. But briefly, some scholars have focused on the ways in which fictional texts leverage the same kind of responses to partial perceptual cues that activate responses to real objects in the world. My own personal quest has been to study the reality effect not so much through cognitive, but through emotional and psychological explanation. My hunch is that the feeling of fiction's reality is activated precisely through those moments when that thick, immersive feeling seems to get shifted or transferred from one domain to another, from book to life, but also from past to present to future and between people. And when I say personal quest, while trying to understand how fiction feels real is an insanely broad topic, I also do believe that all scholarship has an autobiographical component, and this project certainly does. When I was a nerdy teenager, I had a strong sense that I lived a mode of living in which experience was going on in books, but not in my life. A perceptible shift in where experience was located happened once I left home. In this project, I am trying to address that shift by returning to the books and authors, the 19th century British women novelists, that I buried myself in as a teenager. My more specific hunch is that those thickening, experiency, shifty feels of the real derive special thickness when they seem to get bound up with emotional or ethical relations between people. When an experience seems to get handed from one person to another in a gesture of recompense or care, attended by interpersonal emotions of remorse, regret, and restraint. Okay, that last claim I'm going to put on hold for the rest of this presentation. While this project does have a theoretical component, it also makes an empirical contribution, and I will share some of that with you today. As a case study, I'm going to share some of my research into the ways in which later 19th century women writers' vigorous debates about the place of experience in the life and writings of the Bronte sisters intersected with debates about this term in late 19th century philosophy. I will share my research about how and why so many late 19th century thinkers defined and debated experience the way they did, and introduce you in particular to two fascinating figures in these debates, the philosopher Shadworth Hodgson and the philosopher, novelist, and Bronte fanatic May Sinclair. I hope to show you ultimately that moments when Sinclair identified that experience shifted from one Bronte, from one domain to another, from life to literature, from literature to life, from one Bronte to another, and ultimately when experience seems to get transferred from a Bronte to another woman writer, captured best this era's feelings, this era's ways of thinking about how to categorize the feeling of living. Okay, I will introduce you to Victorian discussions of experience by looking with you at an odd episode from the book that truly set the terms for all later 19th and early 20th century Bronte fan writing, The Life of Charlotte Bronte by Charlotte's friend, the writer Elizabeth Gaskell. This book will appear, and particularly that picture will appear later in my talk. Okay, this is an episode in which Gaskell asks Bronte if she has ever experienced the effects of opium, and I will read this passage. I asked her whether she had ever taken opium, as the description given of its effects in Villette was so exactly like what I had experienced, vivid and exaggerated presence of objects, of which the outlines were indistinct, or lost in a golden mist, and etc. She replied that she had never, to her knowledge, taken a grain of it in any shape, but that she had followed the process she always adopted when she had to describe anything which had not fallen within her own experience. She had thought intensely on it for many and many a night before falling asleep, wondering what it was like or how it would be, till at length, sometimes after the progress of her story had been arrested at this one point for weeks, she wakened up in the morning with all clear before her, as if she had in reality gone through the experience, and then could describe it word for word as it had happened. I cannot account for this psychologically. I am only sure that it was because she said it. This passage demonstrates in a nutshell, or in A Drop of Opium, the peculiar relationship between Gaskell and Bronte's experience. Here, the only actual experience is Gaskell's experience of taking opium. The passage begins and ends with Gaskell's first-person account. The experience of taking opium is then handed off to Charlotte Bronte in the middle of the paragraph, and she is able to transfer it from imagination to real feeling to fictional. But how especially odd that the experience that Gaskell uses as a test case for Bronte's experience transferring abilities is that of taking opium, in which ordinary sensory experience is distorted in all directions, objects becoming both vivid and indistinct. Two last points in relation to this passage. First, in taking up the issue of whether the Brontes wrote about what they had experienced or wrote about what they had not experienced, this passage prefigures, as we shall see, the central issue of later Victorian Bronte appreciation. Second, what does this passage exactly say about what Victorian writers understood experience to mean? Okay, in this passage, two different shades of meaning are at play. There is, in Gaskell's second usage of the word, the fundamentally biographical meaning, experience as the things you have done, things that you can claim as your own. The problem for Charlotte Bronte in that paragraph was that opium was not part of her biography. It had not fallen within her experience. But playing around Gaskell's first usage, when she describes what the experience of taking opium was like, vivid and exaggerated presence of objects, lost in a golden mist, and etc., is what we can call a phenomenological account of experience, a focus on sensory apprehensions and qualities in the moment. Versions of these two shades of experience one cumulative and biographical, one more immediate and sensory, can be throughout histories of attempts to define this term. Gaskell's opium paragraph exemplifies how literary and philosophical writings often sought simultaneously to show how closely these two shades of experience are tethered together through a narrative, and to separate them. That is, on the one hand, Gaskell implicitly participates in a narrative in which biographical continuous experience is made up of multitudes of moments of sensory experience. But on the other hand, Gaskell is fascinated by Bronte precisely because she seems to exemplify both the possibility of experience's virtualization and the possibility of abstracting that sensory experience from biographical experience. We will see across the Victorian experience talk an array of definitional and conceptual possibilities. They range from isolating the biographical from the phenomenological, to conflating the two, attempting to disambiguate different classes of experience, for scientific, religious, aesthetic, and attempts at coming at a unified account. And talk about it they did. From the middle of the 19th century through the first decades of the 20th, experience seems to have reached the status of a fashionable concept of urgent interest to writers and readers across many fields, topics, and genres of writing. We can find blunt measuring sticks to document this mushrooming of experience fever by conducting digital searches on a number of corpora. And here's a Google Ngram of usage of the word experience across British text in Google's database. I've run a number of studies like this through different platforms, all demonstrate an upswing in the appearance of the noun experience, with particular peaks of usage in the last few decades leading up to the turn of the 19th century into the 20th. The reasons for this upswing are complex, but one reason is that there was a huge interest in finding holistic alternatives to the fundamentally empiricist British way of thinking about experience, which had come to dominate the sciences and the professions and divided it up into so many classifications. Okay, and so here are two brief passages. On the one hand, exemplifying the sort of fundamentally British empiricist way of thinking about experience as individual, observable accounting for objects in the world that we associate with the 18th century empiricists such as John Locke and David Hume. And here's an example from a 19th century idealist on the other. The British idealists of the late 19th century saw themselves as correcting for the metaphysical and methodological errors that they saw in the fundamentally empiricist way of accounting for knowledge. They felt that in taking individual observed experience of the natural world as the possibility, as the basis for all knowledge, the empiricists had produced a kind of fragmented account of reality. Okay, so somebody like F.H. Bradley, an important Victorian idealist, strove for something he called absolute experience with a capital A, capital E, that overcomes the divide between subject and object. For Bradley, immediate experience in the world is the ultimate starting point for philosophical inquiry. It is broken up in thought, but carries within itself the impulse towards its own transcendence. You can see that in the passage on the slide. But the most astounding late Victorian monument to the meaning of experience was the philosopher Shadworth Hodgson's massive 4-volume tome, The Metaphysics of Experience, published in 1898. Totally neglected today, Hodgson was a quirky thinker who devoted a lifetime to crafting an alternative to both British empiricism and idealism. He was friends with William James, and much of what we know about Hodgson's life and career and the development of his thought is through his friendship with James. His effort to craft an alternative to both empiricism and idealism culminated in this great book, The Metaphysics of Experience. In it, he sought to nudge the concept of experience towards something more subjective, comprehensive, and phenomenological. And here's his definition. It is our experience of being, this mass of feelings, perceptions, and thoughts, whereby we seem to exist as persons in a world of persons and things, actions and events, unquote. However, as the bulk of the metaphysic of experience goes on to experiment with what gets included in and excluded from what Hodgson called actually present experience, you start to feel the fullness of experience slipping away, not actually existing, but existing, if at all, only in the thin pages of this very thick book. In fact, in Hodgson's analysis, experience is truly present only as a momentary thickening as it is on its way past us. In his discussion of the relationship between experience and time, what he called the empirical present is always carved up into two sections, a part felt as coming or growing stronger, and a part felt as receding or growing fainter. Our actual experience is weighted towards the latter. That is, each moment of present experience is only really experienced by us insofar as it is immediately transferred into a retained object, as what Hodgson called the whatness of a moment of experience occurring in real time is transitioned into its thatness. How all of this works is often disconcertingly vague, in the words of one commentator. But at bottom, Hodgson's point remains that we perceive the world not so much as it comes upon us, but as it takes its leave from us. Hodgson's 4-volume project of reconstructing the steps by which we experience experience is more than a little bit crazy. But the truth, of course, is that questions about whether experience feels like happening just now, or just past, or deferred to some future point, and whether it takes place in books or in life, these tend to feel like urgent questions to bookish people who may worry that their experience is highly mediated, displaced, or deferred. And I'd like to do a shout out here to my nerdy adolescent self who sat in the basement of Firestone Library, poring over books about the Bronte sisters, consciously waiting to grow up so I could have an actual life, an actual experience. For the remainder of my time today, I will mostly focus on May Sinclair, my main person today, a super bookish person, a poet, idealist philosopher, and novelist. And let me just interrupt and say, if you're looking for some excellent coronavirus quarantine reading, and you haven't read any of May Sinclair's novels, I highly recommend them. If you like Virginia Woolf and you've read everything by Virginia Woolf, I totally, I'd be happy to recommend some of Sinclair's novels, which are fabulous. Okay. Like Shadworth Hodgson, Sinclair was deeply invested in finding an alternative to British empiricism, deeply invested in reevaluating experience, and deeply invested in the Brontes. What I have discovered is that for Sinclair and other late 19th and early 20th century women writers, writing about the Brontes was truly a way to do a philosophical investigation of the meaning of experience. This is a time when very few women had access to actual formal study of academic philosophy. But for ambitious Victorian and Edwardian women, from Elizabeth Gaskell to Virginia Woolf, writing at least one essay about the Brontes was a kind of rite de passage. And the Brontes' narrow little lives at Haworth Parsonage in the north of England and their extraordinary imaginative output together represented an intriguing case against which to try the meanings of experience. In particular, they debated what happened to experience when Charlotte and Emily finally left Haworth Parsonage for their brief year living in Brussels. For many writers, Charlotte Bronte's sojourn in Brussels was the moment when experience transferred from the realm of books and dreams to the realm of real life. It was, it often appears, like the transition from black and white to technicolor. In Gaskell's words, at last she was seeing somewhat of that grand old world of which she had dreamed. And from that point onward, in many accounts, Brussels was synonymous with experience. And from that point onward, Charlotte's novels were, in the words of one author, quote, mainly delineations of actual experience, or, said another, a literal transcription of actual facts. Charlotte, in this view, wrote novels that were, to borrow a phrase from the 20th century novelist Sylvian Townsend Warner, carpeted with experience. In contrast, one of May Sinclair's main goals in her passionate, beautiful book-length essay, The Three Brontes, is to demonstrate that the Brontes owed nothing to experience. Writing obsessively about the Brontes was for Sinclair most clearly a way of doing philosophy by other means. She was an absolute idealist who, in her own philosophical writing, went one step further than, say, F.H. Bradley's attempt, which we looked at a minute ago, to reconcile the concept of experience with idealism's belief in a transcendent, holistic worldview. She just trashed the concept of experience completely. So, in her writings about the Brontes, she describes Charlotte as having lived, quote, a life singularly empty of experience, unquote. She is contemptuous of other Bronte fans who viewed the sojourn in Brussels as Charlotte's entry into experience, or who suggested that she had suffered something like experience in her struggles with her world-class loser brother, Branwell Bronte. Sinclair was sometimes willing to concede that Bronte's imagination waited to some extent upon experience. She quoted approvingly the opium transfer passage from Gaskell we looked at the beginning of our time together today. But Emily Bronte, her favorite, was in her view an absolute experience virgin, an experience virgin in thrall to the absolute. Emily was, this is part of the passage on the slide, a woman destitute of all emotional experience, a woman who shows the emptiness, the impotence, the insignificance of all we call experience, beside that is compared to the spirit that endures. Emily is the ideal subject of idealism with a capital I, who captured all the hunger and thirst after the absolute, with a capital A, who had a direct line to the real with a capital R, quote, the incredible, unapparent harmony that flows above, beneath, and within the gross flux of appearances. So in other words, Sinclair truly believed in a transcendent world beyond what we can see and felt that Emily Bronte had a kind of beeline directly to that unseen world. We may see Sinclair's drive to purge the Bronte's world of the gross flux of appearances in the descriptions of Haworth that grace the opening pages of her book, The Three Brontes. These opening descriptions are actually a revision to the famous opening passages of Gaskell's book. It had become customary for all Bronte fan literature to, to begin with a version of how Gaskell started her book, which was with a kind of cinematic rendition of a traveler's approach to Haworth, with sweeping views of the bleak New Yorkshire moors, up through the desolate town of Haworth, and arriving at the even more desolate Haworth parsonage surrounded by a graveyard. In reality, Victorian Haworth was actually a pretty populated and lively place. Here, however, is, and here's a photograph of Haworth from the era. Here is May Sinclair's stripped down version. Quote, "It is impossible to write of the three Brontes and forget the place they lived in, the black, gray, naked village, bristling like a rampart on the clean edge of the moor. The street, dark and steep as a gully, climbing the hill to the parsonage on top. The small oblong house, naked and gray, hemmed in on two sides by the graveyard, its 5 windows flush with the wall, staring at the graveyard where the tombstones, gray and naked, are set so close that the grass hardly grows between." This is the world of appearances, limbed down to an almost invisible palette and pure geometry, as if almost nothing will stick to the clean edge of the moor. It is all outlines and lines. Described this way, the landscape is the embodiment of pure form, the ideal, whereas in most writings about the Brontes from Gaskell onwards, experience equaled color, fuzziness, heaviness, and thickness, something like what that other Bronte lover / experience hater, Sylvia Townsend Warner, described as a slab of experience, like a slab of pudding, which had lain all night, solidifying in the larder, unquote. We will come back to this image of Haworth in a minute. However, even experience-hating Bronte lovers, such as May Sinclair, sometimes cast the Brontes as sealed off from experience in order to create something like experience through chains of vicarious living through and writing about the sisters. Writing about the Brontes may thus be seen as pondering, much as Shadworth Hodgson's metaphysic of experience did, whether actually present experience is felt only in fleeting moments when it seems to transfer from one domain to another. So, for example, Sinclair, who described Emily as a woman destitute of all experience, also argued, nevertheless, that the source of Charlotte's writing was not her own experience, but Emily's. Even though Sinclair had contempt for critics who saw Brussels and experience as synonymous sources for Charlotte's work, she writes, and yet an experience did come to her in that brief period. It was Charlotte's experience of reading Wuthering Heights and not her own personal experiences in Brussels that jump-started her own great novels. As these examples suggest, even the most philosophically anti-experienced Bronte interpreters could not do without experience altogether. The most actually present experience, Hodgson again, described in Sinclair's The Three Brontes, is Sinclair's own first-person account of reading Elizabeth Gaskell's The Life of Charlotte Bronte. Sinclair concludes her book by noting first, there has been too much talk about experience. What the critic, what the impressionist of the Brontes needs is to recover before all things the innocence of the eye. No doubt we all had it once and can remember more or less what it was like. To those who have lost it, I would say, go back and read again Mrs. Gaskell's Life of Charlotte Bronte. Okay, from there follows an incredibly vivid account of stumbling across Gaskell's book, a small shabby volume, in her father's library as a child. An account that's so beautiful, it's hard for me to resist reading the last 3 pages of Sinclair's book aloud to you, but I won't, and my talk is almost done. She starts, however, with a description of the illustration on the title page, and this is the description. The title page was adorned with one bad woodcut that showed a grim, plain house standing obliquely to a churchyard packed with tombstones. Tombstones upright and flat and slanting at all angles. In the foreground was a haycock where the grave grass had been mown. I do not know how the artists, whose resources were of the slenderest, contrived to get his overwhelming but fascinating account of moorland solitude, of black-gray nakedness, and abiding gloom. But he certainly got it and gave it. Okay, so on one side here again is the illustration from the title page of Gaskell's book that Sinclair is talking about, and the other side is the photograph on which it was clearly based. This is hardly, to me, an overwhelming and fascinating work of art, okay? Something is going on with May Sinclair's intense reaction to this picture. It seems especially interesting that she focuses on the haycock, and that's that lump in the front, into which the grave grass has been mown and raked. Especially the description I read to you earlier, where she describes the clean, Teflon-like surfaces of Haworth, to which no experience will stick, in which she says the grass hardly grows. Interestingly, the original photo did not have this heap of grass, and that's really the only difference between the photograph and the wood engraving. Here we seem to have something of the bare, naked, experience-resistant nature of Haworth being made by Sinclair herself, being raked up into a shaggy lump. There's another picture. Sinclair claims that when she read Gaskell's Life of Charlotte Bronte, she was in the grip of a reality more poignant than any I had ever known. There are pages in it that I shrink from approaching even now because of the agony of realization they revive. All through the book, she says, she found an invisible, intangible presence, something mysterious, but omnipotently alive, unquote. Through the medium of Gaskell's account of life at Haworth Parsonage, Sinclair experiences a total transfer of Bronte experience. Quote, I knew every corner of that house, she declares. Via Gaskell, Sinclair takes on the experience of the little Bronte sisters, but in this scene of reading Gaskell on Bronte, she also seems to become like the little Jane Eyre, sitting alone and a window and reading. Sinclair ends the three Brontes by describing her first-person account of reading the life of Charlotte Bronte, with its dense layers of reading and living, its swift relays of real and fictional first persons, as an innocent impression. But we are in a zone where an innocent impression is indistinguishable from a thick, powerful experience. Okay, to wrap things up, my goals today have been to explain some of the debates around the term experience in 19th century British philosophy, and to show one way that women writers of the period engaged in this debate. The empirical new findings here are that there was this mushrooming of talk about experience in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. It was caused by a dissatisfaction with the ways empiricist scientific disciplines had carved up and categorized modes of experience. This upswing cuts across both literature and philosophy, and it explains the terms of the debates that people had about the Brontes. But my ending is also, I think, a message to my adolescent self, a reassurance that perhaps vicarious experience isn't so bad. You take what feels real to you and you work with it. I hope also this talk has given you some feel for my practice and method as a scholar and critic. They include interpretive analysis, working with echoes and associations among texts that rattle around in my head, putting together well-known works of literature with research into fugitive writings that were part of the historical nexus from which they came. An investigation and above all, investigations of questions that seem deeply personal, but are hardly unique to me. A search for finding ways of confirming that thinking about fiction is a way of exploring the feeling of living. Thank you.